The correct response, I would say, to try to summarize it, is to respect the dignity of each and every single human person by giving every one of them access to the opportunity and means to become an owner of capital and to pursue using their labor if they choose to do so, to contribute as full human persons in the fullest possible way.
Here we go. Welcome to a special edition of the Focusing Way podcast. I'm your host, David Battistella. We call these special editions The Way is Love. Find The Focusing Way on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and our website, thefocusingway.com. Today on The Way is Love on the Focusing Way podcast, we're talking global economics. It's a big subject and we're mostly hearing about it through the sloganeering of our age. Put up your hand if you've heard the words "build back better" more often than you wanted to in the last 2 years. I know I feel I have. Perhaps even more so, we have been hearing these other 3 words which promise a wonderful future: the Great Reset. My guests today are Michael D. Greaney and Don K. Browhawn. They're the co-authors of a book called The Greater Reset: Reclaiming Personal Sovereignty Under Natural Law. And here's part 2 of our conversation. As I read your book, I feel like I'm in a poker game with very experienced players who know how to manipulate the table, read the cards, and study the gestures and the behavior of all the other players.
Yes,
and
it's
our system is built completely on the production of wasteful products. We're completely focused on wants over needs. And this seems like a vicious circle. People are advertised to death in order to consume, and then when they overconsume, they're chastised as the destroyers of the planet. So somebody knows what's really happening. Who do you think that is?
Yes. Well, I would say that it is the system, and it's a complex system, and what's really accelerating the processes of greater and greater concentrations of power. And this is also the power to produce and receive the income. It's in our processes of how we finance growth. And this is another just falsehood. I mean, not in an intentionally evil way, but just it is an assumption that the only way that people can become owners of this productive capital is to work hard, save their money, and then invest on Wall Street. And that, as Mike can explain in greater detail, is absolutely false. And this is where the ideas also of, and we mentioned Louis Kelso in this book. He was a corporate finance lawyer who wrote 2 books with Mortimer Adler in the 50s and 60s, which looked at really now another way of looking at economic justice, participation, distribution, and how you correct the system if it's flawed. And what Kelso brought in was the idea that people can become owners of capital not by reducing their past consumptions and saving in a bank account, but by producing in the future, meaning if they have access to a loan for purchasing that capital, and there's the other question of collateral, if they can purchase capital that will produce things in the future that will generate a profit, it's from those future profits that you can repay the loan. So and they did this with what's called employee stock ownership plans, where the workers, up to 100% of workers in a company could purchase all the shares in a company and pay for them, get a loan through this. They used a trust instrument, get a loan and repay the loan through the corporation's profits that they're helping to create. So this is just a way of, now we got to look beyond corporate employees, because frankly, that's a small percentage of, how people work in today's world. So how do we make that universally accessible? And that's part of, in the last portion of the book, where we talk about a principle-based approach to how we finance new growth in the economy that automatically connects every human being individually. And they're free to do this or free not to, but this is available to them so they can become owners of the new technologies that are going to, make it possible for us to have time to think.
You put your finger on one of the most ludicrous problems with Keynesian economics, which is, Kelso called it the slavery of savings. We call it the slavery of past savings to emphasize this. To Keynes, the only way to produce was with labor. Capital only enhances labor. Well, but you need capital in order to make labor productive. Big contradiction there, but let's jump to the next point, which is that where do you get the financing for new capital? Well, by producing more than you consume. Well, if you can only produce by cutting consumption from what you've produced, where did the production come from in the first place? Another contradiction. But in order to finance these increasingly expensive new capital instruments, you need people who are so incredibly wealthy that they can afford to save to buy these things. Well, where are they going to get the money? Well, by producing a lot of things that people don't need or want and convincing them that they do need or want it, so that you shift purchasing power from the poor to the rich, so that the rich can become richer, so that they can afford to create the environment which allegedly creates jobs for people. But actually what you're seeing is that technology is advancing so fast that it's actually eliminating jobs, not creating them. But the whole thing that Keynes overlooked, and which Kelso saw immediately, was that, but you don't finance new capital formation by cutting consumption in the past. The people who got these enormous accumulations of capital did it by increasing production in the future, past versus future savings. So what we have is a monetary system and a banking and central banking system designed to operate on the basis of what Kelso called future savings, but it's being used as if it were based on past savings in a way that makes the rich richer and the poor poorer, rather than, as Kelso advocated, let's reform the entire monetary system, give every single person democratic access to an opportunity to use future savings, a new type of money. Actually, it's the most ancient form of money, but this will open up the and this Economic Democracy Act that we talk about would allow every single person to become an owner of capital, not by taking away from the people who have, but by allowing them to become owners of the as yet uncreated wealth of the future. Now, let's take this and apply it, for instance, to Ukraine. President Zelensky did a very intelligent thing the other day. He invited the Russian oligarchs in to say, we need your help to rebuild this country. We'll do all kinds of wonderful things if you bring your money with you. Well, I'd like to be able to sit down with President Zelensky and say, I think it's great that you want to invite the Russians in to help you rebuild your country, but you don't need their money. You have a commercial and central banking system that, if used properly, can create every single person in Ukraine an owner of the new Ukraine once you get rid of Putin. And this will build true ownership. Right now, the Ukrainians, they do own their land spiritually and politically, as long as they can hold out, but they need to own it actually and directly. And every single person should have the access to the opportunity and means to become an owner of the new Ukraine. And of course, everybody in the world should
or
be
the
able
new
to
Africa, or the new India, or the new China, or the new anywhere, right?
Or the new United States, or the new Canada, or the new Mexico, anywhere. Even the new San Marino.
That system you're talking about applies anywhere if it's used with correct, not like in a.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to read from the book again, because there's great little quote I'd like to read here, and then we'll move on to our next question here. But so here's the open quote. Whether the pandemic and subsequent Great Reset is a conspiracy or the result of opportunism is irrelevant. The real problem is what to do about the situation, and the Great Reset is not the answer, close quote. So we do, in economics and many other topics, spend a lot of time arguing over semantics, and you rightly pointed out that it's far better to move immediately to solutions. How the problem arrives is less important than solving the problems we have right now. But you say in your book, The Greater Reset, that the Great Reset is just the wrong response. What would your presentation to the Economic Forum look like? What is the correct response?
The correct response, I would say, to try to summarize it, is to respect the dignity of each and every single human person by giving every one of them access to the opportunity and means to become an owner of capital and to pursue using their labor if they choose to do so, to contribute as full human persons in the fullest possible way to the advancement of human progress and to their own growth in virtue, and to repair the system and build it for the benefit of everyone. I mean, if I were saying, for instance, again, to bring in Mr. Zelensky, I'd say, if we could do it for Ukraine, we could do it for Russia. We could do it for everywhere.
Yeah, and go ahead,
Right.
Don.
Oh, I'm sorry. And I would say we have to understand, we have to look at money in a different way. Right now, money is viewed as a creation of the state and using the central bank to facilitate that. And it's now, in terms of what money is backed by, whether you're talking the dollar or the euro, the ruble, whatever else, it's now become reflecting government debt, or it's backed by the actual debt of the government that has to be repaid. If you're going to follow the property principle that a debt must be paid, whether it's an individual or a government or a company or whatever else, who's going to repay it? It's going to be future taxpayers. That's a whole nother question. As you see wealth and income becoming more and more concentrated, the question of who's going to pay taxes and whether that'll be sufficient, and whether the government's going to have to take care of people in one way or another in order to, keep human beings alive. So if we go back to we need a reexamination of money. And it's what Louis Kelso, how he defined it. He was a lawyer, and he's looking at it in terms of money is really a symbol, a way of measuring value between when we enter into transactions and exchanges. So it in itself, it's an abstract concept that we use to facilitate our real life production and consumption and exchanges. So if we think of this as not something, physical that must be, even a chunk of gold or a piece of paper or, electronic digital currency, but really underlying that, is there something of value standing behind what we say is money? And money, as Mike, as he's our monetary historian, it really has been manifested in many different forms, but always those forms in the minds of the people engaging in a transaction, they're coming to an agreement that this is a fair exchange. We've arrived at some agreement in our own minds of what this is, what it is, how we would value these things. So money facilitates that. So if we look at money as more of a lubricant of growth and change and really solving the problem of where people are going to earn their incomes in the future and be free, then money is not going to be something that if you have it, great, you'll be able to get more. If you don't have it, too bad, you'll either have to work hard or someone's going to have to give it to you. No, we can see that money we have to be thinking in future ways, that if we can determine that some capital instrument will be able to produce something that there's a market for, and that you have customers with money and they want this thing, then in terms of the banking process, then a lender will say, yes, that's a feasible project. So we can anticipate you'll be able to repay this loan over a reasonable period of time. Okay, so, whoa, wait a moment. But what happens if your loan goes bad? If you can't repay it, do you have money saved up as what they call collateral so that the lender is made good if you can't? Well, the ordinary person says, I really don't have money in my bank account to serve as collateral. What do I do? So Kelso came up with another systemic solution to the problem of how people in general will have collateral, and that's using capital credit insurance. And we have things like insurance companies that insure our lives and our cars and our health. So this is a way you can insure capital loans. Now, if a lender says, well, okay, this loan is so risky that this is the premium you're going to pay for insurance. And it's like, you're going to pay an 80% premium on this loan. We all go, well, that's not a good loan. Let's not try and borrow for this purpose. I'll have to come back with a better proposition. So it's within there's a whole system that involves the seller, the buyer, the investor, the commercial banks, insurance companies, and then ultimately the central bank now this is a mysterious, frightening creature to most people, the Federal Reserve. Oh my God. I mean, there's so many conspiracy theories connected with that, and, conspiracies, real or whatever. But we have to get back to what is the purpose of a central bank. And Mike he's really the expert in this, but it is part of an orderly social system by which we can create money as needed, as long as you've got a truly productive project you can create money for that. And the central bank just turns promises and contracts into spendable money, because, if you're going to do this generally throughout the economy, we can't be writing out contracts and handing them around. So it's a marvelous human invention that has been misused, misunderstood, misused. And you're absolutely right. We need to be educated as to these essential things within our economic system, because that's going to enable us to be free. But Mike is, as I said, he is the expert in how all the mechanics of this.
Michael,
if you'd like to know why economics is called the dismal science, it's because of they misunderstand money. They think there's this thing called the currency principle. All that means is that most economists in the world today and all the politicians think that the quantity of money determines economic activity. In reality, as Kelso acknowledged, economic activity determines the amount of money. Money is a tool. That's all. Once we get that and we understand the true essence of money, as Kelso pointed it out, economics changes from the dismal science to I'd say, the hopeful science.
That's when it's paired with what you were talking about earlier, which is human dignity and giving each and every single human being the access to it through the right to work or the right to own property. Why? Those two fundamental rights that even if there's no money in the equation, the human being has to have the right to access that money through owning property and owning their own labor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. In fact, by producing, you actually create money in a sense, because as Adam Smith's first principle of economics, people like to excoriate Adam Smith as the great demon of capitalism or whatever. His first principle was consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production. If you're not going to consume it, why bother to produce it? Well, Keynes said, well, you have to produce in order to accumulate wealth so you can accumulate more wealth. No. As Jean-Baptiste Say pointed out, given that consumption is the purpose of production, how do you consume? Well, you have to produce. You can't consume something that doesn't exist, can you? So in order to be able to consume, you either have to produce it yourself, or absent charity or theft or conquest or something, you have to produce something that you can trade to somebody else for what that somebody else has produced that you want to consume. And that process of exchange is what constitutes money. And of course, you have to come up with some common unit of measure and common values and agreements and everything else. But all the complications of modern economics come from misunderstanding that essence of money. Say, Jean-Baptiste Say said it, he didn't come up with these ideas, but he said it best, so that they call it Say's law of markets. Consumption equals production, therefore supply generates its own demand and demand its own supply. Income equals production, therefore supply generates its own demand and demand its own supply. Karl Marx and John Maynard Keynes rejected Say's law because they assumed that only labor produces, not capital. So who needs to own capital? Well, the rich, so they can get more
I'm
money.
going to read this quote because it's right in front of my eyes, and that is, quote, "This is where Keynes did incalculable damage by treating money as a commodity, the price and quantity of which can be changed at will by the state, instead of as a social tool to facilitate exchange. If money is a commodity, then the more you get, the better for you anyway. If money is a tool, however, then having more than you need to carry out transactions is waste. It's also unjust, as it prevents others from participating in the economic life to the fullest," close quote. But it seems like the prevailing attitude of the elite is always that their solution is the only solution. And, what do we do about these monolithic systems that consume everything in their pathway and leave no room for this small ownership that we're sort of talking about here?
That's where the act of social justice comes in. And of course, to give a free plug for the book, which is what we're talking about, how to do it is outlined in the book, and as is the program, what we call the Economic Democracy Act. Now, this has the benefit to the rich because, frankly, when things get bad enough, the next thing you know is that the rich are swinging from the lampposts, which, frankly, I don't want to see that. The rich certainly don't want to see that. But we're not talking about taking what they have away from them and redistributing, which is what the Great Reset is talking about. What we're talking about is opening up access to the as yet unformed wealth by reforming money and credit and people's understanding of private property and how economics really works, rather than how Keynes and others have told us it does work, in a way that respects the dignity of every single human person and gives them access to the opportunity and means to participate fully. We call this participative justice, so that distribution of the benefits is equitable throughout society. And of course, if it gets out of joint, then we correct it with acts of social justice. One of the biggest problems in the world today about understanding Catholic social teaching is that people misunderstand social justice. They think it's a replacement or a substitute for individual justice and charity. No, it's a way of fixing the system so that individual justice and charity can function once again.
Yes, and I would say, I think Mike has given really the necessary framework in order to look at how you change immense systems. Obviously, that is not easy. They've been built up over centuries, and they've been built up with all of us being kind of blind to what actually is. We're starting with assumptions which are provably false. I mean, you can prove how someone without any assets can become a capital owner through access to a capital loan that's collateralized with insurance and paid off, in a predictable time. So that's already been proven. But in terms of how you shift this huge existing system onto another track, we have to look at law, for example, how you introduce laws, how you educate people about the new laws, because this is going to be so foreign to most of us. Very few of us have ever had the opportunity to be able to live off our capital incomes. I'd say tiny fraction. But what we can do right now is, and this is part of the act of social justice, is you find people who share this common concern about what's going on. They see something's wrong. They want to come up with a solution that will benefit every person, will harm no one. And so they want to start with the right principles to understand what's wrong. And now how do we have to go about fixing it? And they identify where the big structural defects are, how to change that. And, there's been a lot of thinking over decades. So it's not like we have to start from scratch. But once you have, and this could start as a small group of people all around the world, thanks to the internet, coming together, learning and discussing these ideas, having ways, understanding what sort of changes need to be made in terms of our monetary laws, our banking laws, our tax laws, even our inheritance laws. But knowing these have to respect private property and the dignity of each person. Now, with that, then it's a matter of organizing to let more people think about this idea and see that it's to their benefit. They could solve the problems of poverty in terms of structural systemic poverty and war, what brings about conflicts and environmental damage. What can we do that still respects human dignity, that respects the creation around us, and is able to come up with solutions that are tolerable and can become part of our daily lives. So in this book, we mentioned something called the Economic Democracy Act, and people can find out more about that on the website of cesj.org. We invite everyone to visit that. And then we need to, especially within academia, that is I would say, the biggest barrier right now to these ideas. It's so foreign. It's, being a different paradigm, it's invisible. Even when we explain it, in the minds of the academics hearing this, most of them, not all of them, it just sounds like gobbledygook. It sounds irrational. So we need to get to open-minded people everywhere. The young need to hear about this. And we're saying, consider these ideas. What might the future look like in terms of your life, in terms of your family, your community, your country, the world? If we now go back to this idea, each of us is important, each of us is sacred. And how do we make it possible for this sacred creation to be able to develop throughout their entire lives? So we have the means, it's now the knowledge getting out there and a practical,
I was just going to ask, what does the small model of this look like? What does it look like at a neighborhood level or on somebody's street? I'll just let you.
Excellent. Because we realize that ideally a country would adopt this as their nation's law, because that would cover every person in that country. But realistically, and I'm talking in terms of the U.S. law and U.S. legislators, and it's highly unlikely, unless you have a very charismatic, knowledgeable, moral leader, that this is going to happen overnight. It's not. But we can demonstrate certain aspects of this within communities. For example, those that need to rebuild or build new infrastructure because that's crumbling, and how the use of land is carried out. And one of the mechanisms, there are various mechanisms for connecting people to the financing to do these things. We call the Citizens Land Development Cooperative. And it is essentially something that it's a land planning corporation, an infrastructure planning corporation, whose shareholders automatically are every child, woman, and man within a geographically determined area. So it could be in the poorest of neighborhoods that they know that they could bring in, new industries, new businesses, create new infrastructure, but they need the money to do this. And so through this mechanism, it's not, ultimately we're trying to develop accounts for each person from the day they're born till the day they die, in order that will be a channel through which new money and credit can flow as long as there's productive projects. But to just focus on the development of communities, and this could be actually extended to entire states or regions, that this is a way that each person would have an equal lifetime, non-transferable voting shares.
I should mention that this does not exist in legislation. This is a proposal.
Yes, and we're proposing this starting in St. Louis. And we're working with the group called Descendants of American Slaves for Economic and Social Justice. And their approach to reparations is not to just hand out cash to individuals for things that may have occurred generations ago, but to repair the system so that not only the most disadvantaged, but everyone, including the billionaires, would have equal access to the new money and capital ownership formation that will take place. So you don't have to do this thing with universal basic income where you say, okay, you go to Jeff Bezos and you say, okay, you own all this fancy technology. Well, we're going to tax you, special tax on you, and then we're going to use that to write out checks to everyone, including yourself, because this is how it's going to work. Everyone gets to get $1,000 a month. All right. Great. Well, not great, because it's not representing new growth. It's just chopping up whatever exists.
And whatever exists right now, a lot of it's
empower.
in this false economy that's been created that's not pegged
Yes.
to a currency that is
asset backed.
The book is The Greater Reset, Reclaiming Personal Sovereignty Under Natural Law. Be sure to tune into part 3 of our conversation. Hey, if you made it this far, thanks for listening. Tune in on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe. Join our mailing list at thefocusingway.com.